Hey everybody, Happy New Year. Welcome back to Trace Models. This is going to be the first build of the year for 2023, and it's not going to be a plastic kit. It's going to be a Metal Earth folded kit. I got this as a gift for Christmas for my oldest son because he really likes to torture me. But all kidding aside, we're going to dive into this and see what we can do with it. So let's talk a little bit about the kit. Special tools required. You could use a bending jig. Something this small, I've found that you can use tweezers and a straight razor. And as long as you pad the tweezers with some kind of tape, I use the Tamiya kabuki tape to keep from scratching the surface, you're pretty good to go. Really, you don't need a whole lot of special tools with this. Bending jig is nice, but not necessary. So let's build on. Okay, when you're building this, you need some certain kind of tools to get the right curvature. You don't need to buy anything special. Pretty much anything on your bench is going to work for you. You just have to make sure you find the right diameter. What I found is to size things up with the base of whatever round tool you're going to use. Put it on the fat part of your finger, roll it back and forth until you get the curve you want. It's easier to over curve it and then spread it back out than it is to try to pinch it in. Try to pinch it in, you have a good chance of kinking it. The whole point behind this model, for lack of a better word, is it can be built without using glue. You can do that, but it's a whole lot easier if you invest in some Starbond black flexible CA. We'll get into that in a minute. Yes, it can be built without glue, but I highly recommend getting some CA and doing it that way. This kit builds from the tail forward, and basically what you're doing is you're folding the pieces in and moving in a forward direction, and every piece forward locks in. So you got to make sure that everything that you have, if you're not going to use glue, is as tight as possible. And then that means is when the tabs go through the insertion slots, you've got to make sure you grab them as close as you can to the surface and pull them and get them folded over tight. If you're using the glue, you can be a little less attentive to this part because the rubberized glue is going to hold it in place. But if you don't want to use the glue, you really got to pay attention to this particular part in the build. Everything folds together in a pretty easy method, but it all builds off of it. So if you get it wrong in the beginning, it's not going to get better towards the end. Okay, one area that I did deviate from the construction was the very tail cone where the rear pusher prop hooks up. They say you can get this to work without glue. The ring that holds the pusher prop assembly in that goes onto the actual tail boom, you're going to have to deform that in an extreme amount to get it to fit in the tabs. I went around this and got a piece of regular drinking straw, cut it down, inserted it into the tail boom, and used the flexible CA, taking care not to fill up the slots because you're still going to need those at the very end. And we'll get into that when we get into the pusher prop section build. Moving forward on the build, you're going to start moving closer and closer towards the front from the rear, obviously. What I did was put a piece of masking tape between the segments after I interlocked them. This keeps the flexible CA from bleeding through to the outside of the body. Put this on, and then I used basically a pointed stick, for lack of a better word. You could use anything you really wanted to, and carefully dabbed the flexible CA in between the segments. And the cool part about it is the flexible CA is a dark color, so it's going to kind of hide the fact that you used this to get the segments to glue together and stay together better. It's not going to bleed through the tape if you get the tape pinched down really tight against the surface. And it's flexible, so that's a key point to this build. Everything's folded, everything has to be flexible without breaking the glue joint apart. So flexible CA is a perfect medium for this build. Moving along on the build, I got a little sloppy with the CA glue, I have to admit. Thought, hey, no problem. I had it with some Uncure, which is basically debonder. Everything will be good. Put it on there, started scrubbing. Don't use debonder on this model. It grabs the paint and pulls it right off. So if you ever have one of these that you want to strip the paint off of, debonder's the method to go, because it does take the paint right down to the bare metal. In my humble opinion, one of the most difficult bends in this build is the tail cone for the pusher prop. I started out with a needle file and kept rolling it and working it. The problem is trying to form a cone out of a flat piece of metal. You really have to be patient. It's frustrating. It takes a little bit of work. Without having to repaint it, you could heat this up and anneal it and make it easier to work with, but then you're going to have to repaint it. And part of the allure of the kit is that you can do all this without any glue and having to repaint. I was trying to stick with that theme. And the reality of it is it's very frustrating and very hard to bend into that delicate shape and get that perfect cone. My best advice is just to play with it, take your time, be patient. You're going to drop it on the floor a few times, as I did. Eventually, you'll get it. It takes a while. I think I spent more time forming this little cone for the pusher prop than I did on the whole build. But still, it was part of the process, had to be done. Struggle through, you'll get it. One of the last details we have to finish before the tail bend is complete is to open up the vents in the very back. And this basically you can accomplish with the number 11 blade. Just reach in there after you get it folded into place and pop those vents down to the angle that you want them. Nothing set in stone. You can make them as aggressive as you want. A little bit of an opening is pretty much all you need. Now that we got the tail components finished, start moving into the forward cabin. Again, builds from the rear to the front. The exception being the landing gear. One thing I want to point out, when you fold the landing gear, if you pay attention to how things fold and put the joint at the bottom, it's going to give you a better cosmetically looking model because you're going to have that seam at the top. So yeah, if you wanted to come back and backfill it and finish it up and repaint it, you could do that. But if you're trying to build a model where you don't want to repaint a whole lot of it, try to make the folds go to the bottom side, and it'll make for a better looking presentation. Everything else builds out from the front. The cockpit, there's not a lot going in there. It's basically a floor with a console and some rudimentary seats. There's a lot of room for improvement in here. If you wanted to hyper detail this, you could. There's not a clear canopy to go over this, so it's kind of lacking in that. But you know, it's a folded metal model. You're not going to get clear parts with it. So that's kind of the takeaway. You have to have sacrifices when you're building a folded metal model. You're not going to get all what you would get from an injected molded model. Probably cut that. Getting close to the end of the build, I did leave the pusher props off until the very final assembly. And since I was using the CA glue, I built the tower with the rotor head separate and left that off until the final assembly as well. And in fact, it fit so good I really didn't even have to put any glue on it. Now, looking back on this kit, and it's in 1/88 scale. So I was kind of curious about what that was all about. And the only thing I can think of is shelf space. If you go back into the 60s and early 50s, when the models were just becoming into play, there was a kit form called box scale. And basically what that meant was it fit what was available in the retail spaces up. So that's where you get all these weird 187 scale and all these other off-scale things. It was because that was what the retailers wanted the models to fit on the shelf. And if you look in the sections where the metal earth are, they're all basically the same width. Now they might be a little taller, but they all fit in the same basic area in the display case. So I'm thinking that might have a lot to do with what they decided the scale was going to be. Not sure, can't say that for a fact, but if previous history follows, it makes sense. But basically that's where we're at. Again, you can follow the build sequence as you like. I moved it around just because the pusher props on the back are kind of delicate. You could bump those around, and they're not too hard to add at the back side of the build. Same with the main rotors. It'd be real frustrating to try to build that front canopy and cockpit section with those main rotors in place that the way they want to build it in the sequence. Not too hard to add that as a last minute thing. But all in all, it was a fun build. Wasn't too frustrating. Some of the curves and stuff you can see, they're etched in lines on the inside of the metal. Gives you kind of an idea where things need to be rounded. But again, try not to bend stuff too much, and you don't have to exactly follow the build sequence, and it'll still build into a really nice model. In conclusion, you could build this without glue. There's a couple of spots where it would kind of be kind of loose. Things that I made mistakes on, I was able to come back with the airbrush. I mixed up some semi-flat gunmetal gray to try to match the color of the fuselage. I think I pulled it off somewhat. The other thing is where the tabs bend together. In some areas it's really out of scale, especially back in the tail fins. I found it was more cosmetically pleasing to use the rubberized glue and cut off the tabs so they didn't look so out of scale. Depends on how far you want to take it. It's an enjoyable build. It looks the part when it's all together. It scales out nice. And it's a fun build. I highly recommend it. Hope you guys have a great 2023. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one. Well, thanks for watching. Please hit that like button and subscribe, and I hope y'all enjoyed the video. Y'all be good to each other, and we'll see you on the next one.